Thank you, Wendy, for that very generous introduction. It's perhaps a little bit over the top, but I think it's useful to at least mention some of this trajectory because I did have this early involvement in land tenure studies, which I've been in some ways forced to revisit in the context of the much more recent discussion about global land grabbing. As Wendy mentioned, the paper that I have now was first rehearsed here in a kind of half-baked version last October, and it's slightly more baked at this point. And it's a critique of some of the land data on land grabbing and trying to look at some of the epistemological assumptions. So if you bear with me, I'll read the text and show a few slides with main points and that sort of thing. Land grabbing is grabbing headlines. After Grain ignited a firestorm with its first report on land grabbing in 2008, and the New York Times Magazine gave its imprimatur to the concept with a lengthy article by Andrew Rice, a veritable deluge ensued of op-eds, reports by NGOs and multilateral institutions, scholarly papers, books for specialist and non-specialist readers, and articles in leading social science and general science journals. In addition to Grain's extensive database, which formed the basis for the initial global analyses, the Oakland Institute maintains a catalog of land deals in Africa, and a new website by the Land Matrix purports to provide comprehensive, up-to-date information on large-scale land acquisitions throughout the world. Claims about the scale of the problem appear to be escalating as well. The Economist reported in 2011, the International Land Coalition, a non-governmental organization, it's not really an NGO, but that's another story, reckons almost 80 million hectares have been subject to some sort of negotiation with a foreign investor, more than half in Africa. This estimate is far higher than the previous one by the World Bank, which last year, that is 2010, said that foreign investors had expressed interest in 57 million hectares. It is higher still than one by the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, which put the figure in a 2009 study at 15 to 20 million hectares. So you can see the estimates are going up and up and up. In 2011, Oxfam asserted, topping all previous estimates, that 227 million hectares of land, an area the size of Western Europe, has been sold or leased since 2001, mostly to international investors. The bulk of these land acquisitions has taken place over the past 2 years. Michael Kugelman, who cites this Oxfam study, reports it is nearly 230 million hectares. So there's a little rounding area of 3 million hectares there. At times, the lowly hectare, even in multiples of a million, ceases to be a sufficient measure for communicating the immensity of the phenomenon, and square miles are deployed, both to drive home the vast scale and perhaps to placate Anglophone readers still at ease with the metric system. In northern Mozambique, a Brazilian-Japanese venture plans to farm more than 54,000 square miles. This is a quote from Kugelman in a New York Times op-ed, an area comparable to Pennsylvania and New Jersey combined for food exports. Lest this sort of US-centric reference appear obscure to non-US audiences, the aforementioned Economist article helpfully notes that the 80 million hectares of land that the ILC says has been under negotiation is more than the area of farmland of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy combined. Sometimes the grabbed area is reported as a percentage of national territory to great dramatic effect. And this is a quote from one of these sources. More than 30% of the land in Liberia has been handed out in large-scale concessions in the past 5 years, often with disastrous results for local people. In Cambodia, NGOs estimate that an area equivalent to between 56 and 63% of all arable land in the country has been handed out to private companies. Rulli, Saviori, and D'Orico, this is an article that was in PNAS, one of the main general science journals, claimed that up to 19.6% of the national territory has been grabbed in Uruguay, and on and on. An additional problem involves the inclusion of defective data points in the databases, and all too often maintaining canceled, delayed, scaled back, or non-existent deals, even after scholars and activists have issued correctives. Petrus Brunner, for example, reports that when the Land Matrix database was first released, in its investor top 10, I immediately noticed the entry of ZTE International in the Democratic Republic of Congo, 2.8 million hectares, Wuhan Kaidi in Zambia, 2 million hectares, and Daewoo in Madagascar, 1.6 million hectares. How can these be included? These land deals have never come to fruition. And he goes on listing a bunch of other similar ones. The Land Matrix, to its credit, has taken additional measures to validate reports on the land deals it lists, but criteria for cross-checking are notably vague and inconsistent. The second highest reliable confirmed rating is confirmed after checking, quote, by the Land Matrix Partnership through questionnaires submitted to organizations working in the host country. The exact process for in-country checking varies from country to country. It includes personal interviews or direct personal knowledge of the transaction, as well as access to research that has not yet been published. These qualifications notwithstanding, the very nature of such data compilations is to reinforce both the appearance of scientificity and the hectare-centric alarmism of the land-grabbing discussion. This commentary intends to inject 3 notes of caution into the land-grabbing discussion. First, land tenure is not as easily studied or documented as many reports on land grabbing appear to assume. Second, the fetishization of the hectare, or really of large quantities of hectares or even square miles, as the most important defining characteristic of land grabbing, is fraught with conceptual problems and leads researchers and activists to ignore other, arguably more significant issues of scale, such as the capital applied to the land, the control of supply chains, and the labor relations grounded or brought into being on those hectares. Third, claims with a questionable or dubious evidentiary base call into question the legitimacy and probity of those making the claims. Social movements and social justice-oriented NGOs are rightly concerned about the phenomenon of land grabbing, but their demands for better land governance at the national and international levels will have more credibility if buttressed not just by solid data on grabbed areas, but by a more complex understanding of who the grabbers are, what they are doing or intend to do with the land, and what the social, economic, and environmental impacts have been or are likely to be. Both GRAIN and the Land Matrix, and many researchers who employ their data sets, have clearly attempted to do this. However, a key conundrum remains for both researchers and agrarian and human rights activists. An accelerated process of dispossession is clearly in motion, but countering it effectively requires precise and accurate information, which is difficult to obtain. In the absence of accurate information, oversimplified, outlandish, or sensational claims may not only undermine efforts to counter specific cases of land grabbing and claims about land grabbing more generally, but may also divert attention from less publicized cases and from the actors behind the hectares. These cautions, however, are frequently given insufficient methodological expression, particularly in global analyses that aggregate data on grabbed area derived from a multiplicity of sources. In other words, many researchers acknowledge the obvious that land deal data are frequently problematical, but they then go on and analyze that data as if it were generated in a highly rigorous way. Meta-analyses in medical research aggregate data from studies carried out under different criteria, but at least they have very strict benchmarks for including studies, weigh them according to sample size, and attempt to adjust for other validity problems. Aggregating land deal hectares, in contrast, may produce and even augment statistical errors because the land data probably do not vary randomly, but very likely often vary all or mostly in one direction, that direction, up. And even the World Bank concedes this. Land-grabbing alarmists are also insufficiently appreciative of the complexities and ambiguities of studying and measuring land tenure on the ground. Ethnographic or historical analyses of landholding patterns force researchers to confront the quality of the data in ways that analyses at larger scales or advocacy tracks are not required to consider. While such approaches are necessarily micro-focused and labor-intensive, and thus of limited usefulness for making claims about global trends, they are much more promising for uncovering on-the-ground realities and for avoiding the delegitimizing impact of making spurious claims. Okay, my slides are all in a peculiar order here. Okay, in the 1980s and 1990s, I was involved in an on-the-ground and historical studies of land appropriation, tenure, and conflicts in two regions of Costa Rica, one a province and the other a canton, which is roughly equivalent to a county. Both regions were obviously small and at opposite ends of a small country, and one might reasonably question their relevance to debates over global land grabbing. In each place at various times, however, large landowners, many of them foreign, had amassed vast estates. When the recent furor over land grabbing began, two main questions occurred to me. The first was historical. How did the current wave of land acquisitions or land grabbing differ from what had occurred, say, in the Costa Rican province of Guanacaste in the 1920s, when a single latifundista, a North American, had consolidated control over properties that I estimated at 133,808 hectares? There's also a historical question I'm going to bracket here, and basically thinking about what is different in the post-2007 or 2008 wave of land grabbing and these many previous cycles of land grabbing, but I put up just a few of the elements of it here. The scale of it certainly is relevant. The increasing financialization of agriculture and land, biofuels, environmental services, green grabbing, and so on. But I think the important point is that a more historical approach to land grabbing would look at these previous cycles as being the forces that create these spaces in which contemporary land grabbing is occurring. Okay, and here's just a little slide that gives a hint of the type of financialization of land that's going on now. Those of you who are vested in the TIAA-CREF retirement plan can invest in land grabbing if you so choose. And the graph here, which is from the Wall Street Journal, it's headlined, "They're not making it anymore," and I'll come back to that at the end. But it shows the land available is the green line going down and the price per acre. So you can see it's a very exciting opportunity for investors. Okay, the second question, beyond the historical question that occurred to me, had to do with, okay. I'll leave this up for a minute. You can multitask and listen and read. The second question that occurred to me beyond the historical question was an epistemological one and much more complicated. Studying land tenure on the ground over time is extraordinarily messy and inevitably confronts the researcher with numerous methodological and epistemological enigmas. These come to the fore in local and regional studies, but they tend to be elided or at best downplayed in global analyses of the recent wave of land acquisitions. Carrying out rigorous small-scale regional studies of land tenure involves a kind of labor-intensive archival research and local knowledge that is likely impractical for analyses of larger-scale phenomena. Nevertheless, the question of how do we know what we know which small-scale research unavoidably highlights, remains important in evaluating the evidentiary basis of the claims that are made about larger scales. To put it bluntly, scholars of land grabbing may need to be reminded of the old computer science adage, abbreviated politely with the acronym GIGO, and less decorously as SISO, or shit in, shit out. That is, if we input lousy data, we can only output questionable findings. This section can only begin to enumerate the multiple forms of confusion and ambiguity that make understanding land tenure on the ground difficult. My main empirical reference here are Mexico and Central America, but it should be emphasized that other researchers' work on different world regions and on the history of measurement suggests that the problems I point to are not particular to the Americas. Let's see, okay. Many titles specify areas that are in archaic units of measurement and that were calculated with antiquated surveying techniques. In much of Central America and Mexico, for example, surveyors from the 17th to the 19th centuries, who often did not know the rudiments of Euclidean geometry, measured large properties with a crude compass and a waxed cord of 50 varas castellanas, or Castilian yards, which was about 41 meters. In order to inscribe titles in caballerías, a measurement of surface area variously described as the amount of land that a horse can plow in a day. Which horse, and which land? A reward given to conquistadors who had served in the cavalry, or a number of hectares that changed over time and that legal authorities considered to have distinct extensions in different countries and at different moments. When the boundaries of properties titled in this way were remeasured with modern surveying techniques in the early 20th century and after, they frequently contained areas in hectares that were much larger than the supposed equivalent in caballerías contained in the deeds. Landowners were then often permitted to claim the demasías, or excess lands, and register them. Smallholders, too, commonly registered titles or at least measured their holdings in old units. Most commonly in Central America, the manzana, equivalent to 0.7 hectares, or in Guatemala, the cuerda, with many different equivalents. It is still not unusual to encounter peasants who report that they own, say, 10 hectares, and who then in the next breath indicate that it might really be 10 manzanas. In Mexico, small maize farmers frequently reported the amount of land they cultivated in almudes, an old Spanish and Arabic unit of volume, not of area. This practice of measuring surface area with units of volume is so widespread around the world that Witold Kula, in his magisterial work Measures in Men, termed it astonishing. Typically, crop yields in such contexts are reported as the ratio of the volume of seed harvested to the volume sown. When harvests began to be measured instead in relation to the area sown, it often reflected a growing scarcity of land combined with an abundant labor supply. In Mexico, 1 almud of land was a surface on which a farmer could sow 1 almud of maize, spacing the plants at distances that presumably hadn't changed much since before the arrival of the Spanish in the New World, or alternatively adjusting the spacing according to the fertility of the soil. The almud in Puebla was roughly equivalent to 0.5 hectares, though in Chiapas it was closer to 0.67 hectares. In northwestern Costa Rica, boundaries between properties increased in importance in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when cattle ranchers began to improve their breeds and when markets sprung up for agricultural commodities and valuable hardwoods, which, unlike transhumant livestock, were fixed in place. And this is the cover of the book that Wendy mentioned where I talk about this in detail. But property boundaries were often specified in vague terms in title documents or were natural features such as rivers that could and did shift over time, or large trees that died, fell down, and rotted. Some boundaries were delimited with concrete markers called mojones, or stone cairns, but these too deteriorated and sometimes disappeared. A common judicial procedure in 19th and early 20th century Guatemala and Costa Rica was called avivamiento de mojones, literally reviving or giving life to the boundary markers. Not surprisingly, bringing missing property markers back to life provided landlords with ample opportunities for expanding their holdings, because the marker could have died here and you bring it back to life over here, so you gain this much territory. Smallholders often don't have a precise idea of the extension of land that they own or work, and large landowners, when asked, frequently intentionally understate how much land they have, fearful of agrarian reform agencies, peasant land recuperators, and neighboring property owners who might have designs on their holdings. This generalization is consistent with manuals on rural survey research that have long warned that questions about resources, and land in particular, are likely to generate unreliable responses and dubious data. Large landowners also often divide holdings into sections controlled by different family members or corporate entities, even though the sum of the parts functions as a single investment or production unit. Different aspects of a single unit, similarly, may be held by distinct legal entities. A single farm may, for example, have several corporations owning or leasing its land, others owning its livestock or crops, and still others owning its vehicles or buildings, or providing machinery, fumigation, and management services. Such paper divisions are likely to increase in the face of political pressure, whether government agrarian reform programs in the past or civil society scrutiny of large-scale land acquisitions in the present. The corporate entities involved in farming and ranching, in Central America at least, have been extraordinarily complex for a very long time, and may very well be more so now in the post-2007 land grab era. And here this is conjecture to some extent, but I suspect that's true. They consist of astounding combinations of national, regional, and extra-regional capital originating in diverse sectors and activities. Frequently land-rich, money-poor rural elites who inherited large estates form companies with money-rich urbanites and foreigners, much as the land-rich, money-poor governments now grant concessions to capital-rich outsiders. The mercantile registry entries that record these coalitions rarely contain accurate information about real levels of capitalization. They often refer to corporate owners or subsidiaries domiciled elsewhere, which makes identifying the capital behind any particular farm quite challenging. For all of the above reasons, titles and leasing contracts are often overlapping, imprecise, legally defective, misleading, and sources of contention, while ownership information is often obscure, partial, and imprecise. These are not only historical curiosities or problems of yesteryear. A World Bank report on the contemporary land rush observes that, I'm quoting, even if the land transferred to investors is quite valuable, many countries devote little attention to administrative records, particularly the geographical description of boundaries for land allocations. Potential negative consequences include the double allocation of land to different parties, the inability to unambiguously ascertain who has rights to a given piece of land without costly field investigation, and boundary disputes that undermine local rights. Moreover, land grabbing always involves a confrontation with pre-existing class structures and local and regional peculiarities, especially historical patterns of land use and ownership. Understanding this process and the social conflicts that may result from it requires scholars to develop an in-depth knowledge of traditional tenure patterns. Similarly, establishing a baseline from which to measure the impacts of land deals necessarily entails a serious consideration of pre-land deal social formations. Okay, the epistemology of data sets and sources. Every data set has an implicit epistemology behind it. Different kinds of data sets are created for different administrative, bureaucratic, political, or other purposes, and always contain systematic biases. The same is true for the individual documentary or other sources that become the data points or entries in the database. The social scientist or historian is obligated to account for the existence of the source she or he employs. Who created it and why? What were the circumstances and context of its production? What accounts for its preservation, its location in an archive, or its diffusion? What does it say and what are its silences? In the context of the current discussion of land deals, one might interrogate in these ways sources as diverse as the articles in the business press that often constitute the first reports on particular grabs, or the crowdsourcing reports that led investigators to highlight new grabs or to verify unconfirmed reports. Who leaked the story to the journalist from the Financial Times? Or alternatively, how did the journalist stumble upon it or decide to cover it? Why did that story and not something else serve as the first indication that a land grab was in the works? Was the leaking, if that's what it was, done to denounce an injustice, to attract new investment partners or lenders, to increase shareholder value, or to establish legitimacy vis-a-vis skeptics in a government bureaucracy? Did journalists tend to highlight international investors and ignore domestic ones, as well as investors of any provenance that acquire existing farms and plantations instead of new lands? Who constitutes the crowd that does the sourcing? What motivates them to become sources, and how does that affect what they report? In addition to these fundamental concerns, there is the question of the biases in the databases themselves. Is the emphasis on certain geographical zones, sub-Saharan Africa most importantly, an artifact of available sources, or alternatively a reflection of on-the-ground realities, or most likely a combination of both? And if the latter, how knowable are the proportions of the combination? Surely the land-grabbing databases are influenced by both over and under-reporting. Yet the difficulties of identifying and compensating for these biases are not easily addressed. Yet data compiled in a base, set, or table has a way of assuming a credibility that may not be merited when its origins are examined more closely. My skepticism about these matters is rooted in part in a study that Mitchell Seligson and I carried out in the 1990s in a single canton in southern Costa Rica. And this is the reference if anyone's interested. This canton had been settled by non-indigenous people for approximately 50 years, which was also approximately the period in which there were agricultural censuses. So we compared the pictures of land tenure change in this zone that derived from agricultural census data on the one hand, and from cadastral property and mercantile registry data on the other hand. In the same physical area over the same 3-decade time period, the two data sets provided what were essentially diametrically opposed pictures of land tenure change. Agricultural census data generated a picture of rising inequality over time. So you can see the blue line on the graph, rising and then slightly declining. Land records, in contrast, showed declining inequality. It is worth emphasizing the point. These two contrasting data-based pictures were of the same physical area during the same period. We found that an inverse relationship existed between farm size and the probability of a landowner reporting that farm to a census taker. We also found that a positive relationship existed between the size of a farm and the probability of a landowner legally registering the property. Large landowners are interested in using properties as collateral for loans and in protecting them from competing claims. They are less likely to provide accurate information on farm size to census takers for several reasons. Censuses in Costa Rica were administered by rural school teachers, whom large landowners frequently considered politically suspect. Census reports have also historically been used by agrarian reform agencies to identify areas with potential for agrarian reform. We documented the disappearance from the agricultural censuses of thousands of hectares that large owners failed to report in a small jurisdiction. Smallholders, on the other hand, frequently cannot afford the time and money necessary to fully legalize their lands. Some even view reporting to a census taker as a kind of official recognition of their holdings. The messiness on the ground and in the data sets points to some legibility problems. In numerous developing countries, national governments and international institutions, notably the World Bank, have been encouraging the creation of modern cadastres in order to bring some order to the illegible mess on the ground. With the widespread use of GPS mapping and surveying technology, the precision of this endeavor has greatly increased, even as its costs have fallen. Behind this effort to convert everything into hectares, and not just hectares, but verifiable and registered ones, is not just an epistemological assumption that the domain of landed property is easily knowable, but also a theory of property. In essence, this theory, with roots in the work of Harold Demsetz, Hernando de Soto, and others, holds that property law and guarantees, especially clear titles, are the sine qua non of economic development. This principle, so the argument goes, is scale neutral, so that the poor should be equally interested in receiving clear property titles as the well-to-do. With titles, they can become subjects of credit, expand and intensify their operations, and generate new income flows. Improved and digitalized land information will make markets function optimally and generate a more efficient allocation of resources. What is missing from this analysis, however, is the element of power, and not unrelated, the very substantial costs of titling. In the messy context of rural zones in poor and developing countries in particular, larger, more powerful actors are almost always better equipped to take advantage of clear property titles than are smallholders. While customary and informal tenure systems may facilitate land deals and buttress grabbers' claims about terra nullius, it is hardly the case that titling, or what Hetherington terms cadastral fixes, necessarily provides smallholders protection. Indeed, for the rural poor, property titles can and do operate as a double-edged sword, facilitating access to formal and informal credit with all of its real and potential benefits, but also exposing them to the risks of indebtedness and, in the worst of cases, foreclosure and proletarianization. If the poor may cultivate illegibility about the land areas they control, the wealthy seek to make their own areas legible for the purposes of obtaining legal guarantees, registration, leases, and so on, while simultaneously cultivating illegibility about ownership through the use of corporate holding companies, subsidiaries, and cutouts. Both of these zones of illegibility pose significant challenges to land deal researchers. Paradoxically, as Nassim Taleb suggests, the abundance of data can be extremely harmful to knowledge. More data means more information, perhaps, but it also means more false information. Hectare-centric analyses of global land grabbing, almost from the beginning, have suffered from indiscriminately including data points in the data sets. If the very researchers involved in constructing the databases frequently lament the inclusion of cases that represent canceled, delayed, modified, or even non-existent deals, this has not resulted in any fundamental rethinking of their objectives, their theoretical and methodological framing concepts, or their approaches to studying land grabbing on the ground. It is worth reflecting on the process of solidification and fact creation that the databases represent. In this commentary, I've called attention to several mechanisms through which this occurs. Among these are the inclusion of preliminary, anecdotal, unverified, and moribund cases in databases and published reports, which then inevitably appear to be written in stone. The aggregation of dissimilar and sometimes faulty data, followed by the trumpeting of ever larger, increasingly alarming totals of hectares grabbed. The use of exponents to report these totals, as if these were the findings of a physics experiment, and the deployment of disclaimers which, while perhaps covering the author's hindquarters, rarely seem to have altered the underlying assumptions and methodologies even one iota. The almost obsessive focus on hectares, while no doubt effective in attracting the attention of major media, foundations, policymakers, and civil society organizations, leads analysts to downplay other dynamics and to assume a commensurability that is likely spurious. Questions of scale do not only involve extensions of land, but also the application of capital to that land, the availability of water, and the types of accumulation and social reproduction that these factors facilitate or impede. Surely, a medium-sized irrigated farm dedicated to a high value-added crop or a rare metal mining concession of similar size is worth vastly more than a much larger tree plantation or a massive expanse of semi-arid grazing land. The point could be made with more emphasis. Some portion of the land being grabbed is no doubt held for purely speculative purposes and will never be developed. But for that part which is acquired for cultivation, the amount of capital required to bring some of the extensions that are being talked about into actual production is likely beyond the capability of even the largest transnational corporations. For example, the 54,000 square mile or 14 million hectare Pro-Savannah project in Mozambique, mentioned in the introduction to this paper, is roughly the size of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, or we might add of Nepal, Greece, or Nicaragua. What begs the imagination is how even the most massive Brazilian-Japanese venture could mobilize sufficient capital to produce food for export on such a large farm. And some of the NGOs, Grain, for example, still talk about this as being a single farm. Moreover, in the land deal literature, there has been little, if any, discussion of the diseconomies of scale that would surely be operative for such an enormous enterprise. What then is to be done? The increase in land deals in recent years is doubtless real, but the evidentiary basis for understanding it is frequently very weak. A key word in thinking about the evidence might be indicative, a term employed in one of the caveats that I cite in the paper. Indicative, of course, means pointing to, but it also implies a certain epistemological caution and a need for developing more solid evidence before making claims. Certainly, many media and crowdsourcing reports are little more than indications or guides about where to look or where to pursue more in-depth investigation. Treating such reports as more than that leads to a slippery slope where almost anything qualifies as firm evidence. And I might add that if we use the land databases as a sampling frame of which cases to identify, then we're also reinforcing the validity of the databases, because there are many cases that aren't recorded in the databases. We need case studies that are both more numerous and more rigorous, and perhaps even more importantly, a deeper discussion about the kinds of inferences and generalizations that we can reasonably make from such case studies. Case studies of land deals are not only useful for shedding light on aggregate phenomena or filling gaps in knowledge, they're likely and unavoidably the main means through which scholars and activists can reliably understand what has occurred and what is occurring on the ground, and to establish baselines for measuring subsequent impacts. The hectare-centric emphasis of much of the land-grabbing literature also tends to obscure two critical issues. The first, mentioned above, is the need to specify the kinds of hectares, cleared and leveled, highly fertile, irrigated, arid grassland, etc., and the levels of capitalization that are actually or potentially involved in particular land deals. The profitability of farmland is famously affected by differential rent, yet analyses of land grabbing have paid insufficient attention to differences linked to different kinds of production systems and natural endowments. A second critical concern is the tendency to conflate the grabbers with their countries of origin. This arguably makes sense in cases that involve state-owned companies, sovereign wealth funds, or corporations that are closely identified with or owned by heads of state or ruling families. But this is not the case with most land deals. Many involve complex combinations of domestic and foreign capital of distinct origins. The social movements and NGOs that seek to combat land grabbing require detailed and precise information on their adversaries. They're not well served by analyses that describe the enemy as China or Brazil, especially if they are seeking to generate solidarity within the global South. Scholars of land grabbing are fond of quoting an adage attributed to Mark Twain, and this is also on that graph from the Wall Street Journal I showed you. Buy land, they're not making it anymore. Unfortunately, some of the more alarmist analyses seem to take literally another of Twain's aphorisms. Get your facts first, and then you can distort them as much as you please. And I should maybe add regarding that last saying attributed to Mark Twain, which is, you can find it everywhere on the internet in various forms. When you trace back where he actually said that, you can't find it in any of his writings. It exists in an account of Rudyard Kipling, of all people, you know, the colonialist writer par excellence, who greatly admired Twain, the anti-imperialist, and went to visit Twain in Hartford. And apparently this is one of the smart things that Mark Twain said when Rudyard Kipling showed up at his house in Hartford and they were visiting for a while. So thank you very much.
We have some time for questions, and Mark, I'll just ask you to call on people.
Sure. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mark. There's all kinds of messages in your larger paper, and it really is a great set of caveats to carry into the field, or any of us who engage in this kind of research. I saw myself being guilty of thing after thing.
Me too. You know, none of us are.
So I want to really thank you for pinning this down, and I guess pointing at us as part of the problem. And one of the things that you don't allude to, you may have thought of, or perhaps you said it in some way that I didn't get, but it has to do with the smaller sized land grabs that at least some of the accounts, it's either below 1,000 acres or perhaps 10,000 acres that don't even get counted. And I want to raise it, not just to add to the many other warnings and cautionary tales that you've shared with us, but I guess in the bigger sphere of things, I worry that our fascination with large land grabs, even if we factor in the many, many warnings that you're sharing with us, overlook what may be an astonishing amount of land grabbing, land expropriation, land eviction that never reaches any records anywhere, with or without local land reforms or transfers or financialization, all of the ways that we've kind of thought about it. And I'm just thinking about, on an everyday lived basis, small people with title, with clouded title, or with really shaky no title, get their land grabbed out from them every day. They get evicted, the subject of urban renewals, and this is global. And my guess is that it dwarfs what we're talking about, even with Oxfam's high-end figures. And I wonder what you think about that.
Well, I think it's a terrific question, and I don't address it in this paper, but I am addressing it in a paper that I'm currently in the process of finishing with a doctoral student of mine, Andres Leon. And we're making precisely the argument that I sense you're pointing at, that sometimes the medium size or even smaller land grabs, because of other factors that don't have to do with the extension of land necessarily, become sites of some of the worst agrarian conflict. And we're looking in particular at a very conflictive area in Honduras where there has been a lot of land grabbing in the context of an agrarian counter-reform. And most of it is at a scale that barely would make it onto the radar screens of the various people who are aggregating all the data, because there are different ideas about how to define land grabbing, of course, and many of them do have a kind of uniform quantity of hectares. It's the threshold. Sometimes it's 250, sometimes it's 1,000. But there are certainly many cases where these smaller grabs lead to terrible kinds of social conflict and dispossession. And I think the question of whether the smaller ones, if you were to somehow be able to add them all up, are more than the bigger ones, that's a kind of unanswerable question. But I think the point is definitely worth making, because if we look at the worst agrarian conflicts in the Americas these days, apart from Colombia, where there's a civil war still going on, a lot of the grabs tend to be of this medium size. They tend to be of this medium size, and in areas where there's a lot of agribusiness infrastructure already. And usually they're not grabs of empty land in any sense at all. They're grabs of existing properties. Yes, Ray.
Yeah, I was just curious about the degree to which the language of land grabbing would or would not, and the questions about the small unit you're raising, would or would not be applicable to things like contract farming, Monsanto's monopolization of ready Roundup and soybean production. So how something like land grabbing might look in the United States, for example, and what kinds of problems are there, and what kind of promises there in thinking about land grabbing definitionally, sort of way in which we fit it into a particular kind of vision of what's happening in other parts of the world, right? And sort of questioning of China to go with that, versus thinking about what it might look like here, but doesn't get called land grabbing, or maybe it's deeply flawed to call that land grabbing.
Well, this again, it bears on the question of definitions, because land grabbing is often talked about as involving foreign actors, okay? So there are a couple of things that get obscured in that. One is that the foreign actors are typically operating in some kind of a partnership with domestic actors. And the other thing is that domestic actors are frequently very involved on their own, independently of any foreign partners or whatever. The other thing that comes up in relation to that, which is kind of interesting, particularly in this Honduran case, is that the local peasant organizations in the zone that we've been looking at consistently refer to the main land grabbers as being foreigners. One, they say, is a Palestinian, another is a Salvadoran. Of course, the Hondurans still haven't completely relaxed about the Salvadoran threat, and another is a Nicaraguan. But they're actually all Honduran nationals, and their families have been in the country, in the case of the so-called Palestinian, for over 100 years, but they're still viewed as somehow outside the nation and therefore less legitimate. So the category of foreigner versus domestic is a little bit contentious also. And this, I think, is part of the problem if we're going to look at the question you raise about the United States. I think I mentioned when we were talking about Eunice's paper that there's this USDA study that came out recently that looks at foreign land ownership in different states of the United States, and that Maine is kind of the outlier with the largest percentage of any state in the United States according to this. But in a way, the division between foreign and domestic actors in land concentration in the United States, how meaningful is it really? Because domestic agribusiness is hugely powerful, and most of the actors are domestic and corporate and so on. And then, of course, there are all of those other grabs that don't, in the narrow sense, have to do with the land resource, but with things like the monopolization of seeds that you mentioned, and other inputs. So I think, you know, these are all questions that are interlinked, and the focus on domestic versus foreign actors, the insistence on a kind of ceiling on the size of, or a floor on the size of what can be considered a land grab, I think these are very problematical points of departure. Yes. Yes.
Okay, thanks. There are a number of things I really appreciated about your paper, including the urge to historicize the contemporary land grab, and also to problematize data and really think about knowledge making as a social and political and historical process and so forth. I was particularly intrigued by this phrase that you had about the fetishization of the hectare and what work it does for certain people in certain kinds of contexts. I'm curious what you would argue, though, to say a science studies kind of, that hat on, critique saying there's certain ways in which your analysis might even push it more, that it both critiques the category of hectare or the fetishization of it, at the same time it doesn't maybe go as far as it might. And what I'm thinking here is there were several points where I had the sense where, you know, if we have the right data, then we as scholars or activists or social movements can get, you know, the right outcome. At the same time, it seems like the politics of this knowledge production is so deeply embedded in these complex contexts, and that even the category data itself might be exploded and problematized, or you had this really nice point that hectare captures certain things, but it doesn't capture others. Like, it might not capture the ecological reality of this hectare versus that one. But of course, depending on who you are and your relationship to the land and your history and identity, that category of data or hectare might not be meaningless, because there's all sorts of other kinds of data that matter but may not be captured easily in databases. So I'm wondering if there's, what you would think about the argument that there might be ways to kind of push on this notion of data or hectares even more. You know, what can it capture, what counts as data, how qualitative analysis might inevitably slip out more, some of those kinds of issues.
Yeah, in the written paper, I do get into that a little bit more, although I wouldn't say that I push it really so much in a science studies direction, because I think what's important here is actually not to take a view that's completely agnostic, because I think there is a need for serious information here, because there are concrete social struggles in many parts of the world that rely on the information that researchers produce. And of course, all information and all data are imperfect to one degree or another, even if researchers don't always acknowledge that or treat it in that way. But I think, yes, there are definitely ways in which this critique could be pushed much, much further. It's maybe relevant to mention that I first developed this as a talk for a panel that included somebody from the Land Matrix and from Oxfam. So I felt a certain obligation to accept, to some extent, their terms of discussion, so that there could be a little bit of shared subjectivity, and so that they wouldn't cut my head off. But it was, I don't know how many of you might have been here in October and heard particularly the speaker from Oxfam talking. I don't recall her name right now, but part of what gave me the energy, frankly, to get some closure on the paper was her assertion that it doesn't matter if the data are good, we just need to make claims about big numbers because that's how we raise funds and that's how we get attention. And I thought that was such an appalling admission that it really needed to be addressed, and Oxfam will no longer get the $100 or so I used to donate every year. Give it to somebody else. Wendy, you had a hand up a minute ago?
Well, I guess it's actually a nice segue from that, because at the panel in October, there was some pushback from the social movement activists. And we didn't have many, and many of them were sort of NGOs that are like social movements, so like Food First, right, or Focus. And there was some sort of impatience with academics, sort of, yeah, we have to get the data right, we have to get the details right, but there's a strategic essentialism that social movements engage in that is politically one of their most, powerful tools. And I do think that that needs to be opened up, but I guess I'm wondering to ask you even further two questions. And one is, politically, how do you think that opening up the data and thinking more about the kinds of information that's put out there, the data that we have available, the way that we talk about hectares, how that might feed into a political strategy? Or maybe there are two sides to it. How do you think that UNEC or a group on the ground is being poorly served by bad data? Okay, so
UNAC Mozambique.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they refer to it as one farm and that's not right, but would they have a better political message if their data were more cautious and more, academically rigorous in terms of what's actually happening on the ground? So that's one question. The second question is to ask you, how would you narrate the so-called global land grab without reference to hectares? So if we accept, and I do buy this argument completely, that we don't know what's going on, that it's badly measured, that it's poorly defined, and those two things are part and parcel, how would you talk about what's happening? Is there something happening? Are we all just barking up the wrong tree in terms of thinking about a land grab? Is there something going on?
Well, I thought that I insisted in the paper that there is something going on. So yes, and I'm not against using hectares in discussing it. The question of the strategic essentialism, as you put that, of social movements is a very delicate one, partly because the relations between academics and social movements are kind of fraught sometimes. But it's also delicate because depending on where the social movements are operating and what the nature of the contention is, what is the process actually like, they may be in negotiations with a government ministry, they may be in discussions with the executive branch, they may be, talking to legislators, whatever. And I think then it's important to really control the information well, not to have some crazy half-baked piece of information that comes out of Grain or wherever it might be. It could come out of Land Matrix or Oakland Institute or whatever, because they're likely to be able to negotiate more effectively if they appear there as informed actors. If they come in there ranting about things that really don't have a basis in reality. Like, I doubt that, I don't know much about the activities of UNAC in Mozambique, but I imagine, if they go to negotiate with the government and they start from the premise that there's going to be a single 54,000 square mile farm, that the government people say, well, you're just wrong, that's crazy, discussion over.
It's more the government's putting out an equal load of bullshit.
Well, yeah. Yeah, which can feed into the, yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for your paper. I'm like very provoked. What I really appreciated about the paper is like the kind of questioning you're bringing to this question of numbers, data, hectares, and it actually in a very different field, it made me think of something else. So in India, because they want to reach the, urban spaces want to reach the millennial goal of the UN, or what they are doing is they are not counting the homeless population to show that cities have some level of like wealth or whatever. So there is that kind of a fuzziness to this data, and it helps me think through some of the things. But I'm also equally provoked in a different aspect is, at the same time, this kind of data can be, and I think piggybacking on her question is, it is also kind of a tool for empowerment, like for social movements, fuzzy or whatever they are, they sometimes perhaps need those data, and often they are taken, whatever they are, to make a claim. Like, if I were to take out the whole question of data, how do I even make a claim for something? That's what I was left wondering. Or what are the other possibilities? Perhaps there is a different possibility to move out of this whole question of numbers and go somewhere else and make a claim. Because you are admitting that something is going on.
Yeah, I don't think that it's wrong to have numbers. I think, there's some very, very simple things that both Land Matrix and Grain and Oakland Institute as well could do to have a much higher level of rigor even in the global aggregations that they're presenting. Because there's still very large numbers of cases that never really have reached any kind of fruition at all, that are just on the basis of rumor or crowdsourcing or one or two press reports. Sometimes verified by a phone call to an NGO in that country or to somebody out in a provincial town. And this isn't, this isn't good science. Yes.
Well, thanks very much for your talk. Really interesting and provocative. I guess I want to build on Ray's and maybe part of Chuck's question as well about definition, how we define land grab and how that affects our notion of how much is going on. And this is maybe in the opposite direction, and one sort of implicit assumption about land grabs seems to be agrarian, right? It involves agriculture somehow. In fact, you're publishing it in the journal where you are is maybe indicative. I'm not blaming you for it, but it seems to be this agricultural dimension. And the other is that it has to be sort of private or corporate property rather than public property. Of course, if you look at political ecology, you've got grabbing of land for parks, a kind of public property, right? So those two, and this is because of where I work, but if you actually include sort of public land grabs and you get out of the agrarian view of things, then you don't have to, you can just look at straight land grabs. In North America, for example, probably in the last 2 decades, a quarter of North America has been grabbed in the north, the subarctic, through land cession treaties in Canada. If you go a little bit further back, 90% of Alaska, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, was arguably a grab. It was not negotiated, it was legislated by the Congress of the US, which also gets at your question about historicizing this stuff. And for someone who works on indigenous issues, I don't see anything particularly new about land grabbing in the North American context. I don't see it, people talk about it as sort of neo-colonial. I don't see anything particularly neo about it. Grabbing of Alaska and almost the vast majority of northern Canada is just a continuation of the same kind of process. But it's not generally seen as a land grab because it's not agricultural and because it's a government. It's turned into crown land in Canada rather than or federal land and state land in Alaska.
Well, I think you're right. In engaging in this discussion, one inevitably becomes enmeshed in the frameworks and definitions that people are already using. But clearly, in many places, There's stuff that certainly looks a lot like land grabbing that's not for agricultural production or even for speculation in agricultural land, but is for urbanization, for special economic zones, for industrialization, for airports, for roads, for any number of things. So I think that's right. There are many other drivers to land grabbing, and certainly the phenomenon of green grabbing is very important in a lot of places. So there are many other drivers to this that don't have to do with rising food prices and the financialization of farmland, clearly. And you know, these other factors are, I think, beginning to come into the discussion now a little bit, but until now they've been developing somewhat on separate tracks. There's a pretty large literature, for example, on land grabbing related to SEZs, to special economic zones in India. But that set of research has been largely disconnected from the other more agriculturally centered land grab discussion. And I think you're right that bringing them together is useful, and certainly historicizing land grabbing. I think, you know, the antecedents, you know, we're often blind to the antecedents. The place where we're standing right now is certainly grabbed from native people, as was this entire country and continent. So you're right, none of this is particularly new. Yeah.
Mark, because a number of us in the workshop and in the land project are interested in the seascape and contestations therein. We know that the high seas are being enclosed with various kinds of national and international law and sovereignty claims. And I wonder if, given what Paul just asked you about in some sense, the agricultural bias of the critique that you've provided, which is excellent, does it give you any insights in how we might anticipate the measurement or the understanding, the knowledge that we will take to interpret sea grabbing or enclosure of valuable sea resources? It may be it's going to be different metrics entirely, and it might go to the volume question that you talked about in terms of the way peasants think about the productivity of their land as opposed to hectares. I just wonder if you've thought offshore about this.
I would need to think about that a lot more, I think, to give you a worthwhile answer. Off the top of my head, I think it might be worth considering that kind of question in relation to this very peculiar quality that land has of being fixed in place, which of course oceans are kind of fixed in place, but they're also in some ways not as fixed. But I think I would have to refrain from attempting to answer that. It's a great question, though. Yes?
I was hoping to push you a little more on this question about strategic essentialism of social movements, because it seems like you're not just making an argument about bad science or really sloppy data, but you're also making an argument about the epistemological assumptions embedded in the way in which even potentially good science is constructed around the arguments about land grabbing. And I mean, specifically, you made an argument about how the assumptions around a theory of property implicitly disadvantage the poor. And it seems to me that these are two totally different arguments, because even very good science might have epistemological assumptions about a theory of property embedded in the way that the data is constructed. And it also seems to me that often social movements do use, I think Wendy's piece on the way that neoliberal theories of property align with the way that the MST or other sort of new peasant movements use theories of property to advocate for rights to land are aligned, I think that this sort of, speaks to the possibility that data constructed around a theory of property might be, and I also think that this was sort of Grain's rebuttal to this paper at the land grabbing conference, right, was we talk about land grabbing in this way because this is the way that the social movements that we work with are talking about the way that land grabbing is happening. And whether or not, as academics, we think epistemologically those are good choices, that's very different from saying you shouldn't be using sloppy data because it will implicitly disadvantage your movement. So I wonder if you could sort of speak to that distinction and why this sort of epistemological intervention might make sense on both grounds.
The problem for me is in some ways a very simple one, I think, which is that, one hears case after case after case of usually academic researchers who travel out to the countryside somewhere where supposedly there's a huge land grab occurring, and there's no evidence at all of any of this. And I'm thinking in the province of Cordoba in Argentina and various places in the Philippines and a number of other places. So that's one problem. And social movements in the capital are up in arms about land grabs that maybe are just not yet happening, but which certainly are not actual at the moment. And I try to put myself in the shoes of their interlocutors in the government, and how do you respond to that? You can't really respond to it except by understanding the claims of the social movements as being really without foundation. And I think that's very troubling. And it's not that this has just happened once here and once there. It seems to be a somewhat widespread pattern, so that while I recognize all of these, I recognize the problem that Grain is raising, which goes, I think, precisely to the strategic essentialism question. I think that it's useful always, as somebody who is more of a scholar than an activist, but with sympathies for the activists and with some form of collaboration with them at times, to be in critical dialogue with them. I think we do ourselves and them a disservice by not being in critical dialogue. It's to accept simply these kinds of things is to, I think, not take them seriously.
Maybe if there's one last question, or not,
Yes.
I wanted to offer another quote that's been attributed to Mark Twain related to your databases. The trouble with the world is not that people know too little, but that they know so many things that just ain't so.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that would have been good. That would have been very good. Thank you.
all right, on that note, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.